Welcome once again to Syntax Error, your pretentious philosophical pedantic podcast ostensibly about video gaming and related topics therein. Warning, this podcast contains mature language, content, and spoilers. You have been warned. Hello, and welcome back to Syntax Error. I am Scott Thurlow, aka Job the Lawnmower Man, and tonight I am joined by Brian Oblivion, aka Chris Morgan.
Is there nothing virtual in reality? Isn't all reality virtual anyway?
Well, we'll discuss that. And Stephen Amosi, a.k.a. Morpheus and or Neo, whichever you so choose.
Hey there.
And finally, Jane Manzer, also known as Jamiroquai.
It's virtual insanity.
Yes, and indeed it is. So as you may have gathered, we're going to talk about VR upcoming. If you guys might agree with this, back in the day, this was a dream. It was a sci-fi dream. And especially as applied to video games, I would say that the most immersive game you could play is to be simulated in a world as if you were actually there. So they had, I'll do a brief sort of broad view history, but there's something we're going to get into that's, I think, maybe more important versus our original intent. But at least to start out with, in the mid-90s, I believe 1991, there were 2 or 3 arcade machines that attempted to put the player in a, in quotes, virtual simulated world. You basically had to look through goggles and shit like that. But it was it was a quarter arcade machine. And then Sega and Nintendo, famously, probably the most famous one from back in that era, the Virtual Boy, which was god-awful.
I actually had one back in the day.
How was it?
God-awful.
Yeah, exactly.
You mean it wasn't the coolest thing you ever experienced?
Well, I remember it to this day. So, it
for
left an
being bad, though,
impression.
sure. You remember it because of how horrifying it might have been. Like,
I think
almost
it's because it didn't live up to the promises.
Yeah.
That
I almost just asked you what you didn't remember to this day, but I guess you couldn't answer me on that question.
Sure. But the point is, like you said, it was known for that, but it had so much, that was the thing. It was the dream. You're like, oh, it's going to be finally, as a kid, I want to live in virtual reality. And no, it was basically just a bunch of red lines, red
Yes.
3D lines. That was horrible. But you're right. The key thing there, I think you said, E, is that was the potential. Again, it was the dream. And now we're sort of coming to the point where technology has advanced that we can almost pretty much realize it in the way and the intention that we thought it would be. So the big one is Oculus Rift, of course. I believe they announced themselves in 2012, something like that. I don't have the actual date in front of me, but it was around then.
It's been a while.
And it was a Kickstarter thing, actually. Like, people threw money at it.
Mhm.
And then famously, of course, Facebook, the company, bought them for $2 billion. And we're like, here's $2 billion we're buying you, but we're basically letting you, you do your thing, but we're going to own you because we know that VR is going to be huge.
Yeah.
So now we're arriving at it. And there have been a number of demos and things I know, Valve also famously, when that happened, when the Oculus Rift thing happened, they partnered with HT's, with Vive, I think, or Vive, V-I-V-E. So they're partnering with them, that's their VR. They're going to make games on that platform, sort of the new generation of console wars will be VR wars in a sense. All of this to say, there's a couple of major platforms coming out that are going to use VR technology to create and make games, which is all very nice. However, Stephen Amosi / Morpheus provided us with a number of articles that go beyond just the scope of games and sort of looking into the use of this technology at large, because it is the cutting edge forefront, and so sort of some of the concerns and the considerations that may not be the number one thing that the companies who are actually producing this technology are thinking about, but certainly society at large may want to address them. So would you like to speak a little bit about that, Steve-O?
Yeah, I mean, this is the idea that the ethics of VR could theoretically have a huge impact on society at large as they come to the forefront. There's been a lot of scientific research saying that even short of VR, people are very susceptible to certain types of marketing and certain types of, messing with their
Subliminal
psychological,
things
messing with their
Subliminal.
psychological, constructs. And VR has perhaps have the opportunity to take full advantage of that. And there have been several authors of academic papers and also of, just articles based off
General
of those
stuff,
academic papers for the most part, kind of talking about the possible problems of having VR and what the ethics that we should demonstrate are, really.
Building off that for a second, though not quite VR technology, I like augmented reality technology.
Yes. Well, that's sort
Yeah.
of before you go on, it's not like quite a 1-to-1 ratio, but it's another term that's been thrown around a lot.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think that they're parallel lines, and I
Yes.
actually feel that perhaps augmented or reality technology, like Google Glasses, things like that,
Right.
has the more is likely to influence the average person's life more than VR will
It's,
initially.
I get it. Yeah, I see what
Like,
you're saying.
VR has a greater. It's going to require to the point of the Arnold Schwarzenegger Mars movie.
Oh, Total Recall.
VR is going to have to that Total Recall level.
Sure. I mean, I see what you're
Before
saying.
the average person, yeah, there's video game application, there's military application of VR,
You're saying,
but
but
I
it's more
don't think
niche.
there's
Yeah.
like augmented reality, because the idea like cell phones kind of do provide already augmented
Right.
reality, and that people have things like phantom ring syndrome and vibrations. Like they're already seeing the psychological impact of us being. And I remember reading a thing about the Google Glasses in the military.
Mhm.
People getting like having kind of twitches or develop because they're used to
Accessing it. Yeah.
using the
Sure.
glasses to access the world.
Absolutely, and I think augmented reality is another very interesting topic. Perhaps not so much a game-related topic, but very interesting and very meaningful. But I think that the thing that makes VR so much more, I guess, dangerous if used incorrectly,
Potentially,
like
yes.
if used,
Misused.
as
if
a
people say.
commercial tool or a military weapon, is the fact that it's fully immersive, whereas augmented reality is not specifically fully immersive.
It's augmented reality, of course.
Right.
But I think just to sort of recap, I think you're right, E, that it's if there's going to be like a progression, that the augmented reality would probably arrive first, like be adapted more by the general populace, and then as you were saying, Steve-O, the actual like hardcore immersive in quotes VR would be like the second wave after the augmented reality thing.
In a sense, I think you need the augmented reality first.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah,
To,
you know what I'm saying? Yeah,
Get
I
people
think that. Yeah,
acclimated.
I think
to
we agree upon that.
VR. So
Yeah.
Sure. But no, so the thing is, to go into the second one, we were saying, and as Steve was also saying, that, there are many, so my joke is, yes, I understand there are concerns, but what are ethics, of course, in my monstrous mindset? But it's legitimate, like, the thing I found most interesting in one or two of the articles we read, definitely one, there was one main one that made a lot of very excellent points and was worded very well, that some of the others like sort of address as well, but just not to the degree that this one did.
I actually have that one up. It's called, I don't know if you have the name in front
No,
of you.
give me
but
the title, yeah.
the title of it is, and this is an academic article, I believe, that's
Yes.
like peer reviewed and everything. It's called Real Virtuality, comma, a code of ethical conduct, period, recommendations for good scientific practice and the consumers of VR technology, which is a little bit of
It's academic as hell.
yeah.
I get it, but
a little bit of an enormous name, but
sure. I mean, it's a a cumbersome
yeah.
title. But
Cumbersome is the word that I was looking for sure.
can you give me the authors actually on that article?
It's Michael Medari
Okay,
and Thomas K. Metzinger, and this is
Darian Metzinger.
this came out of a German
A
university.
study. Okay, yeah. So the first thing that they, I'll call them M&M. How about that? The point of it is that it's sort of highlighting the issues that this technology may have attached to it, and that considerations that even the makers, again, like I was saying, of it, like unintentional consequence, to make a video game reference, unforeseen consequences. Let us prepare for them.
Yeah.
And they point out a lot of things. They make 6 major points, which we'll try to touch on and go through. But the thing is that it's interesting to me that even I myself didn't think about it. Like, it's sort of the known thing about new technology in general.
Right.
When it's being produced for a certain purpose, but because it's new, you're not sure how it's going to play out. And this is like our sci-fi dream frontier in a sense. So let's go through the points actually that they make. So number one is that VR should ensures no lasting or serious harm to the user, which is like the first thing is, as I recall, when it was like being shopped around, say, GameWise again, like at E3 and stuff like that, like at PAX. Some people reported like instances of dizziness and even sickness itself.
Yeah.
So it was sort of a disorienting, or can be a disorienting experience, even if just doing a game, going through a simulation of whatever they're trying to simulate game-wise for you.
And I would like to point out that, of course, that means physically.
Yeah.
But also, there's, I think, a psychological aspect to
and
that
that's
as
what
well.
we're going into.
That, and perhaps even more,
Possibly more lasting and
Yeah.
more damaging, if you will.
more damaging. Exactly. The idea that this can cause lasting psychological damage.
Sure.
You can
Could change your behavior, perhaps negatively.
right. You can
Perhaps not,
experience into the to this point the most real, the most simulated experience that you possibly can. If you're playing a game like a war game on a screen, it's a little bit different than like having it in your in your eyes, like in your ocular
purview, if you will.
Yeah.
Sure. No, I agree with that. And it's again, so that's our first point. And the next one is that a lot of article like sort of explores the when they were testing it, like calibrating it, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And like the people who came in to test it, that they should be informed of like all the possible, ramifications of using this technology.
Right.
But and here's my issue with that. It's not an issue per se, but the problem, of course, is sort of recursive that they don't know because it's a new technology. You know what I mean? It's like it's a new field of study in a sense, or at least something that's now been applied to an old field of study, but a new angle. So how can you tell? Like, if they're saying the onus is on the companies to give us like basically the Surgeon General's warning about cigarettes, but now slapped on your VR tech and your Oculus Rift. User, be aware that this device may cause blah 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 blah.
But they already do that. Video games, like
sure, you're right. They have that
say,
warning, epilepsy and all that.
Epilepsy and so forth, and and it's funny because in everything, in every little thing, you have to have some kind of like. It always disturbs me that like you see an Allstate commercial where where the guy's like on the roof of a car. It says, "Do not attempt."
Don't do this.
Like,
sure.
Yeah.
But
so yeah, they're gonna. I don't know what virtual reality is gonna be. It's probably gonna be longer than like the cigarette pack.
right. Well, that's what I'm saying. Like,
And the other thing is that they do point out in the article that they should say on top of everything that the extent of this behavioral influence may not be known. So
that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. Because I was about to say with the whole problem I'm having with this is, and I guess it's par for the course, is that they're trying to like generalize the populace, and everybody's going to react to something slightly differently, and there's always going to be the extremes at the end. And something like you were just saying, I don't remember how you phrased it. You've got to account for all the unknowns in these disclaimers.
Right. So to you were saying just before, yes, video games now themselves have if you're a risk of epilepsy, just be aware of that. But my point was it hasn't been tested enough, VR that is, to say like they don't know the extent of it. So of course, also to your point, yes, they're gonna have to slap on a warning of some sense, but they can't say like how like where the scale lies, I guess. And until like maybe somebody dies of a heart attack or something, as an example that they use while being immersed in VR, then what? Then you have to put that on the warning. You probably will. The thing is, it hasn't happened yet, but there's a very huge chance that it might. You know what I mean?
I mean, this may exacerbate anything that's in what is it, the AMA?
Yeah.
It's just
sure.
like
yeah, exactly.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they cover their asses legally for people that are possibly indoctrinated in some way by VR, like where you
in case of brainwashing, can't sue us.
I mean, it's already happened in video games where people say that a video game made me more violent or things like that. And
that's a huge known thing unto itself. But
because I don't know if they address this later. I haven't read the article, but when you go to war on a screen and are killing people, there's kind of that distance. I think you mentioned that earlier, Steve-O. But if you're actually going through an experience of, let's say, playing, what was that, a PS2 game, Manhunt or whatever it was? A game like that where you're actually hunting down other players to murder them. Or, like, what is the limit now of what is acceptable behavior? What is, like, I think there's actually a movie that does where they allow people to live out their more, like, dangerous fantasies in a controlled virtual reality environment. But again, like, do we want to promote activities where...
Sure, well, that's the question they're raising, exactly.
And, like, this is not just the idea of, like, I from what I gathered so far, they're doing, like, kind of the physical aspects of, like, epilepsy and things
well,
like
starting there.
Well, no, it's not necessarily only that, but, like, these things cover both.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if they addressed it.
Yeah,
the ideas of both.
They start with the physical ones, essentially, and then go on. Go ahead, Chris.
But this actually isn't a new topic because this is going to date me. When I was 7 years old is when I first started playing D&D, and my grandmom had read this book called Mazes and Monsters, where this guy in college got really into like D&D and he got murdered.
Wasn't that a movie?
It was a made-for-TV movie with Tom Hanks.
Yes.
But my grandmom was afraid of me playing D&D for that reason.
D&D is the devil, but
yeah,
sure.
but it's just like this whole.
And you became a godless heathen.
Well, yeah, that was her.
But because of D&D, regardless.
Because of your grandma.
But I mean,
I see what you're saying. Go on.
I mean, but these issues that were surrounding them then are the same issues now. It's just you're
still
putting
valid.
them into a different context.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, but
but it's becoming so much more psychologically affecting, I think. Like the further you get into making this virtual reality your reality.
It's because somebody else is controlling it. It's not like you're using your mind to whatever the
That's
dungeon
kind of the thing, right? And that's like the sort of, if not, I'll use this as a quick reference. It's not it's not the singularity, but it's closer than ever because when you're simulating something, an experience at large, the real and realer it gets, that's the real and real it feels. And that's kind of the whole, like a lot of major points that a lot of this is making.
Also, the issue is we don't know the extent that VR will be able to.
That's what I'm saying too.
Yeah, but like if you look at science fiction that deals with this, like Existence, I think is a great example.
Yep. Which is one of my favorite movies for sure.
Yeah, you don't know. There could potentially be that you don't know what reality you're in. What if you do a VR experience where you do a VR experience which brings you to another reality where you make another VR experience? It just kind of down this rabbit hole.
Sure. No, you're right about
that.
Reality.
Yeah. So theoretically, this does not affect your brain in the way that you understand what's happening. However, at some future point, perhaps it will.
Exactly. And that's the thing. Like that's sort of like the greater point. Like so let me go on to the third point and then try to tie it in. The next thing is that the third point they make in the article, researchers and media should avoid overhyping the benefits of VR. And so, like, I think you can take that both ways. You also have to, I would think, avoid, detracting from it in some way.
And there's a little extra part to this. What they say is they shouldn't overhype the benefits of VR, especially when it's being discussed as a medical treatment.
Yes, that's true. Like, sort of the nuance, like not a nuance, but one specific avenue where that may be more applicable than others. Absolutely. And yeah, I agree with that, but also, like, this one, I think their point here works both ways. So, and that's all fine. But again, I think, like, as we were addressing just before, one of the big broader issues that, even again, nobody knows because it's so new. It hasn't been extensively tested because it hasn't existed until this point. So while they can sort of have, like, indicators that they know it's going to affect people in some way, but they can't say how, to what extent, whether it's beneficial or negative, etc.
Yeah.
Like, it just requires, like, think of it this way. I thought of this, like, earlier, trying to phrase it, that they're sort of crowdsourcing research for a new technology that nobody knows how it might affect anybody in general.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're forced to, of course, in a sense, because now, again, we've come to this, we've advanced so much that here we are, we can able to produce this technology, and again, as I said, the unforeseen consequences of it. The reason they're unforeseen is because they're unforeseen. Like, you can't predict them.
This has never happened before. Exactly. We don't really have full VR.
To actually bring you to a movie that they did we saw recently, which was Captain America: Civil War. They actually have Tony Stark has his VR where he can go back and relive an experience with his parents. But is that necessarily healthy? Like, I can see, going back to that idea of the benefits, I could see that kind of on both ends being incredibly addictive. Being able to regain something you lost.
Right. And being able to
wanting to
quote unquote change the past.
Yeah.
And even though that's not necessarily the healthiest way to get over it, changing it to a way that you want it to be doesn't mean that it is that way,
Right. It might be therapeutic, or it might be, again, like, more harmfully impactful. Nobody knows. But I think that ties into the fourth point that we'll get to.
I was just thinking, when Ian brought up, I was thinking of this episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
I think I was waiting for Chris himself, waiting for Oblivion here to bring this issue up. Go ahead.
Where this character, Reg Barkley, basically has the whole command staff in his holodeck program, where he's wooing, Dr. Crusher and Deanna Troi and all the other, like the captain and Worf and Riker are all like kind of like the fools in his little game. And he kind of became addicted to the holodeck because the holodeck became more real than
more
reality.
Attached to that reality than reality itself. Yes.
And at the end of the episode, he's there on the bridge and he's talking to everybody, like saying it's been a good, run and everything. They're like, we're going to miss you, Reg. And he's like, computer and program. It's just like he had to do the whole thing where he created
Yeah.
this fantasy, and then
Yeah.
he had to choose between the two, and then had to say goodbye, to
Sure.
one of them. And the reason, it kind of reminds me of something that this guy listened to, SF Debris, said about the holodeck being the ultimate expression of gaming. And
Yeah.
that was, back then, they were already addressing that.
Sure.
With the video games back then. They weren't nearly as immersive.
They were exploring the possibilities of it when it
Yeah.
didn't exist as an actual realizable technology. Now that it does, we're
realizing-
forcing to be confronted with these questions that were theoretical questions. Now they become practical questions.
Yeah, like losing yourself in the holodeck, losing yourself in a video game, losing yourself in D&D,
Sure, or whatever it may
losing
be.
yourself in television.
Sure.
I mean, if you look at a lot of like the video games, because I remember when I was a kid, Activision released this one. It was like a first-person shooter spacecraft, and it had Stargates in it. It may have been called Stargate. I don't know.
It was a
And-
poor man's Stargate version, but I think I do remember that game. I don't
it was
remember the
great
name.
because I got to see, you could pretend you were in the cockpit of
Sure.
an X-wing, or
Sure.
and the ships kind of look like the Klingon ships, and I loved it. And then all of a sudden, I couldn't stand it anymore because it was just like it wasn't real enough.
Yeah.
And if you look at TV shows like back in the 50s, Christopher Walken did a parody of it in Saturday Night
Of
Live
course he
called
did.
The Continental,
Yes.
where like in the 50s, they had somebody like Charles Boyer or something like that basically have a virtual date, with like the housewives or whatever.
Right.
And then I was thinking about things like Armchair Tourists,
Yeah.
the video collection that was prevalent in the 80s. So it's just really funny that all that this VR stuff is the ultimate expression of that. We are like between television and not quite to the holodeck, but it's
Approaching it more and more. Sure.
yeah.
I think an interesting question is, are we facing all the same issues that came before and the same fears that came before that proved to be not really the issues? Or is this going to be such a radical change that it creates new fears?
I think it may turn out to. Oh, I think it almost definitely will if it becomes this prolific technology
Widespread
that I
use,
think
yeah.
it's going to become. I think all of what we're talking about now will in another 5 or 10 years seem pretty outdated. Seem very outdated because I think that a lot of these questions will be
Star
answered.
Trek references aren't already outdated?
Not
Well,
yet.
I think that a lot of this stuff will be answered, and certain things about what we're saying, about what people are saying about virtual reality, will be important, and certain things will fall to the wayside.
Well, maybe to answer E's question, yes and no. Of course, the broader concerns are going to be there because you can apply that to anything that humanity, like civilization, progresses through. But as we get more sort of specialized, then there are going to be specialized concerns that are applicable only, that are now going to be applicable to this that they couldn't even have been considerations earlier.
As the technology advances, you're asking the same questions as they did, with D&D. Now, like you just
Sure,
said,
yeah.
you're adding on, but we didn't account for this back then. We
Right,
didn't account
exactly.
for this
There's
with
something.
VR.
That's
There's something
precisely
new
it.
that's going to
Yeah.
come up that we didn't even think about.
Yeah, that's
before.
precisely it.
I would like to point out that it's kind of interesting that we talked about how VR was predicted, and I just did a quick search, and I would like to share this because I think it's kind of interesting. So, the first science fiction story that I could find in a brief search that talked
Mentioned it.
about VR was in the 1930s, actually, which is pretty intensely
Sure,
long
man.
ago. It's this type of technology wasn't even close to being created then, but it's a 1930s.
But like I said, it was a dream of humanity's, if you will.
Right. It's a 1930s story by Stanley G. Weinbaum called Pygmalion Spectacles,
Okay.
and it has the idea of a pair of goggles that let the wearer experience a fictional world through
Sure.
holographic smell, taste, and touch.
So they predicted Google Glass plus VR.
So yeah, I think it's
Sure.
kind of interesting that going back at this point 70, 85
About 80
years.
Yeah.
They were someone was talking about this, and it kind of caught on, I guess, in the 50s, 60s, more so probably in the 70s and 80s.
Well, I was going to say in the 50s because, you had 3D.
Right.
And then they
Mhm.
experimented things with smell of vision.
Sure.
So
yeah.
you smell rose, they'd always try to, put the scent in the theater.
It's
but
such
they
a
couldn't- they
Futurama
couldn't-
thing.
But they couldn't move the scents out quick enough. And then there's a Vincent Price film called The Tingler. And the thing
And
was,
I love
when the
Vincent
thing would
Price.
attack,
Yeah.
when the thing would attack, they had electrodes in the seats to give the
Sure.
audience shock, and they didn't like it.
They didn't like getting shocked.
No, but like,
Oh, weird.
I mean, all the stuff that we're doing with the
Sure.
IMAX, and
They tried to do like one little like singular like aspect of it
yeah,
with
like,
the best they could do at the time.
in
Yeah.
Vegas, they
One
said
old
the
guy
Star
dies,
Trek
and you gotta stop
experience-
shocking people in their seats.
back in in Vegas, they said the Star Trek experience. There's two different rides, and they were both. At times, they'd either move your seat because you're in a car, or like in the Borg one, they had little pricklies all over your hands. It's just so funny. Like, the more we talk about this, and you're talking about the story going back there and what they did in the theater and everything, it's just like humanity has wanted this and has experimented with it in every
May
shape
we get
and
what we
form.
wish for, of course.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think that it is it's going to be what we imagine as quickly as we think it's going to come.
Yeah.
I think that, again,
I would agree with that largely to an extent. Sure.
But here's the thing, like, even with the massive speed that technology moves at these days, it has been a while. We're talking about getting like immersive VR in the 90s. You think back to what we mentioned earlier with the Game Boy.
It wasn't
with the
anywhere near immersive. But sure.
What was it? Game
Virtual
Boy.
Boy.
Virtual Boy. I almost called it Game Boy Advance, but
Game
with the
Boy
virtual,
Advance is much better than the Virtual
yeah,
Boy.
that is correct.
I'm going on record of that. Go on, though.
But with the Virtual Boy, like, that was supposed to be the beginning of the promise of 3D.
Sure.
And it's the same thing as like as tablets.
Okay.
Tablets
your
were
point.
invented in the late 80s, early 90s by Microsoft.
Palm Pilots. I remember those.
Yeah.
Well, that was the Palm Pilots were even way
Blackberries
later. Like
and so forth.
Bill Gates came out with a tablet in like the early 90s, and it was so cost prohibitive, and it was just so not good
Right. It wasn't worth
that
it.
technology to catch on always waits until it's until you're priced in, until everybody can afford it. It's the same thing with like any kind of touch screen. It's the same thing with like big screen TVs.
Yeah, anything like that. Sure.
It's all that stuff.
I was just thinking when you said that. Last time I saw, when I saw 2001 again after not seeing it for a long time, Kubrick predicted the pad, because they're big pads. They're probably about 2 feet, but they're on these flat pads watching TV while they're eating. And I'm like, wow.
Sure.
Kubrick
was a genius, and we can agree with that.
Yeah, or
Obviously.
Clark, or whoever the production
So
was.
here's the thing. That's interesting, but the thing is that prototypes for all that stuff existed when he made that movie. Like, it's not like that stuff didn't exist. It was just so goddamn
It
expensive.
was so specialized.
and
as they were
so
saying.
yeah,
so
and
prohibitive.
right.
Yeah. Sure.
We just weren't ready for it. So it's not like he reached deep into his mind and pulled out something that was like impossible.
Sure, it was sort of a
that he
fringe
put
thing.
something that existed that he was like, maybe this will become popular at some point.
And that's all valid. So about the fourth point I wanted to get to is I think possibly not my favorite, if like choosing favorites, but I think it's the most interesting one because it applies both to this and, as we were saying, to other technologies that come before, is the fact that you have to be aware of the problem of, it's called the problem of dual use of technology. So that is to say, using technology that was invented for one purpose for a completely different one that was never its intention, but yet because it allows it to function that way,
Right.
then you can use it as such. So, for example, as we were saying, Chris and Ian was saying earlier, like military applications, simulating war, essentially. It's not what, yeah, sure, games are doing that, but when you're actually if the military itself is going to use it to train soldiers, say, or to simulate torture even upon enemy captured POWs,
Yeah.
shit like that. That isn't Oculus isn't that wasn't their intent in producing this technology, but because it's there available to use as such, then that ties into the ethical in quotes problems that arise from it.
Right. They actually gave two examples. One of them was actually using it as a torture
Yes.
device, as you just mentioned, and the other one was as a means of decreasing a soldier's empathy in war, which is another really interesting, rabbit hole to go down as far as this
Here's
goes.
the issue, because it comes with all technology. It's not necessarily the horrific things that come from it, but the blandness and the
banal things.
banal things that we
Sure.
develop off of this technology. People
maybe, but-
using it for
Porn.
adult entertainment.
Obviously, yeah.
And people
That's the next thing I was going to
going to
yeah.
take trips to I don't know.
Hey, I want to go to France, but
Delaware.
I can't afford to go there. Yeah. Hey, hi.
Hi, I'm in Delaware.
Armchair tourist and
Yeah. Sure, and I mean, it's all that. You're right. it may not be necessarily as nefarious as like the extreme of it is, but
it's never going to live up to the promise of what we want it to be, though. And I'm saying that as a huge cynic.
That's humanity in general, which I sort of agree with. But nevertheless, like I think another thing that the issue they raised in that article was like living out your dark fantasies. Whether like so, if you're a psychopath and you want to murder and rape people, then you can like live that out. And
without actually doing it in real life, which might be good.
Then if you're not a psycho, like, you know what I mean? Like, it becomes a very blurry line.
Right, it's a strange thing, because that might be a good thing if psychopaths, like actual psychopaths,
can
people
fulfill
like
their desires
can do that without
virtually.
actually doing it.
Sure, that's like,
and
like
if that fulfills their fucking need to do it, and I mean, granted, if somebody actually wants to do it in real life, it's kind of hard to stop them. But like, if they fulfill some need for them,
yeah,
and you can do it in virtual reality, it's certainly far better than actually killing someone.
If you can design the double blind situation for that, you will never have to work another day.
I'm working on my doctorate for that right now. But I mean, that's really
because
funny.
you'll be in jail.
That's a hilarious joke. Yeah. But
Because like, how are they going to test that? It's going to be,
I'll have my one control and then my my variant. But either way, like, as facetious as that may be, and again, as monstrous as it makes us out to seem, it's still a valid concern because it could work. Again, like I was saying to the other point, it might work both ways. If you're a person of certain disposition and you have a certain desire, like I want to punch my boss in the face, say, like
right.
just as a generic Benno example, then if I virtually do that, then maybe I feel better, and so I'm not as like mad at my boss or whatever.
Right? Maybe you're not as inclined to punch your boss in the face, but there's also the possibility of using this as a test environment.
That I'm not going to go
do the real thing.
Exactly. Like right. It's a flip side.
I've created my office. I've created based on probability, wherever everybody's going to be. I've got like 5 different routes to go kill my boss before lunch.
Actually,
it's like
scenario building
murder
is but the use of virtual reality to test scenarios for things is actually
huge.
a very huge.
That's very much true. And like, so it's like this is not specific to virtual reality again per se, but simulations of like early like the universe formation and stuff. If we can simulate that better and better, then in theory that will be helpful for our research, in a broad way.
And we can all just go and be at the...
and you can watch the Big Bang or
actually,
whatever.
You know what? That's kind of a very interesting thing, and I hope that they do that in virtual reality soon so I can watch it. You can go and like sit there at like the formation of a star or something, and just like be enveloped in it. I think that would be really
IMAX
cool.
Theaters for that.
Yeah. Well, it'll be better if it's everything that I can see.
But it could be something like that. But all I'm saying is like, again, it's a double-edged sword, and it's nobody can necessarily predict it because it's so new, and it hasn't been. You just haven't had the time and the necessary abilities to test it out as much, so you don't know the effects.
Can I derail this conversation for a moment?
Sure.
All right. First of all, I want to comment to what you just said, and I bet my money on banality.
All right.
Second,
I wouldn't necessarily bet against you, but I see your point.
Now, I think of 4 new technologies coming up. You have robotics. You have like prosthetics, which I guess is sort of robotics,
like
but
sure.
or like
or
automatons, and you have
cyborg technology,
you have augmentation,
sure.
and you have virtual reality. Which of those is there any I'm missing there, and which of those is the most likely to come about first?
What was it? The third one you said was augmented reality,
like the
or
Google
augmentation.
Glasses, Google Glasses,
well,
augmented reality.
By default, to answer your question,
but I think
exist.
augmentation is the next
the one
step
to hit
after that.
The next wave to hit. Like I said, I made this point earlier. Like, I think it's necessary that one hits first, and then like then VR in general.
I think a big one is,
that.
and this may be covered in one of the other ones, but AI is like huge. I think that's a very, very large and possibly
the next a pillar of those like
right. I guess
I
don't think that's really covered in under any of the 4 that you said.
You're right. AI is absolutely.
But AI is probably maybe the most
in the
important
running.
one.
Maybe, yeah.
Because that's going to be
we've discussed AI before.
A large part of how
stands.
we go forward. I mean, AI already basically runs like Wall Street. Like
sure.
our money is controlled by computers
like
at this point.
Joe the Lawnmower Man is running Wall Street, and I agree with that.
It's just really funny because I'm a Trekkie and that's my religion. And Start is really funny with regard to the holodeck.
Sure.
Thinking back about the next
Listen,
generation
man, real quickly before you go on, don't get me wrong. Seeing the holodeck as a kid, like
yeah,
that was hey, I would love to live
Yeah.
like as such.
But the funny thing is, like looking back on it now, because like watching it when I was in my late teens and early 20s and mid 20s and late 20s,
early 30s, late 30s.
The whole concept of the holodeck, whatever, and they're using it as training. They're using it as, can you inhibit sight? And all these questions were being asked and worked with in these episodes. And now watching them 20 years later, I'm like, holy shit. Because again, we're asking the same questions. We're just applying
it. Now it's closer to realization.
Yeah, now we're like,
than
hey,
ever.
oh my God, a version of this is a possibility.
I would say that a lot of those questions have been asked, like in some form or another,
Sure.
throughout human history. Like, I think that we're still,
of course, that's
I
true.
think we're still trying to figure out the same thing that we've always been trying to figure out.
We just have
and
better,
I think
better
we always
tools
will
to
be
do
until
it.
we kill ourselves.
And
Sure.
speaking of banal, we just got done with renovations, like 2 months of renovations in our house, and I've been so tired lately. I've been playing Fallout 4 and they got the new builder things.
Wasteland Workshop and all
that.
Yeah,
the Wasteland Workshop. So I spend like time just sitting on the couch drooling, renovating basically any one of these houses.
Sure.
I mean, it's like, talk about banality.
And yeah, I say that's what Ian's vision of the
Virtually
future is.
renovating
Yeah.
a house as he's renovating
I
his
can't
house.
add neon lights in my house. I'm going to add neon lights in my house.
And your fake house, of course.
Yeah.
Farmville. There are going to be people who are virtually going to be farmers to take
Like
a break.
literally, virtually hoeing their fields. Like
I've actually heard that. Like people were like, "I'm going to be away for the weekend. Can you like watch my crops? Could you? Here's my Facebook ID."
Sure, no,
Oh, yeah,
I'll
it
bring
was-
this-
Or Euro Truck Simulator.
no, I have a better one for you guys. It sort of ties into the general thing, the introduction part. But one of the demo games that they made for Oculus, I believe, was called Job Simulator. So the premise is, in the future, robots have replaced all human. Nobody has a job anymore. So you can simulate now having a banal like office job if you want, like as a form of entertainment.
But that's what the
just
Sims
to see
came.
what it's all about.
But that's when the Sims came in, when they had
Yeah,
the Sims.
kind of, yeah.
No. Here is,
But I'm
you,
saying
you
it-
go into virtual reality to escape your banal office existence, going farther and farther into worlds where you take virtual reality to get into more and more absurd worlds until you reach the point when you go back to a virtual reality to return to an office job, thus completing the cycle.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's really funny, but like, again, you're right. That the potential is there, and that might be our future. Sure.
Not completely
Look,
out of the realm of virtual
I'm
possibilities.
just going to
Exactly.
say this to any makers of virtual glasses: the first one to get me that Pacific Rim, experience, I'm buying that. I'm buying it.
You're investing your entire savings
Oculus,
in that. Yeah.
yes. Give me a Pacific Rim or Godzilla, and I'll buy your
Sure.
glasses.
You just
All
want to be part of Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Yeah, of course. All right, so that was that one, and like I said, like we just got a lot of content out of that very question.
Yeah.
And that was number 4. So the next two are sort of related. They relate to privacy issues. So the first one is like the potential that when you strap on your VR headset, whatever, it's recording all your like facial tics and your reactions, like your body motions, essentially, your physical reactions to it. So it's sort of like TSA gone, like the nightmare of TSA. Now, like that's every single action you do is being recorded, and they can then the next point, like feeding into that, use that as marketing, essentially. Like
Right.
if a private company, if Oculus Rift owns your playtime, I guess I want to say, and if they can use that data to somehow influence you, or like again like targeted ads, then how much privacy do you give up
And
by subscribing to this?
exactly, and there's so much there's so much data showing that commercial entities having all that data will really affect their consumers and
Sure.
will affect
that's
the
sort of
way
like-
that they think.
That's the
will
1984
affect the-
nightmare
No, if you
that
want to go
pro-
1984, you go Thought Police here, and the people who express violent tendencies in a virtual reality
Arrested, yeah.
world.
or even
Minority
probably
Report.
Minority
Exactly,
Report more
yeah.
so.
Yeah.
But like,
But
yeah,
you're right. Like the general
Exactly.
idea stands for sure. Like the potential for that exists, and that's probably like possibly like one of the major concerns, and maybe the most scary thing about it. Like now, every corporation,
Knows-
government, even it doesn't matter.
the idea
Whatever
is
entity it is.
the idea is that if you can be studied that closely, if you have your facial tics studied to the point
Sure.
where people can know what you're going to do next based on the
Yeah.
way that your face works,
What you're
based on the
doing,
way
yeah.
that your eyes are moving, which is shown to be like basically uncontrollable, the way that your eyes move,
Yeah, well,
like
it's
when
a
you're thinking
subconscious
certain
thing.
things. So if companies can know that, if law enforcement can know that,
Sure. Then
then
what do
they
we-
have
yeah.
such a deep insight into your life that they can
that even you yourself don't have.
yeah, exactly.
sense, yeah.
And the thing is, like anything run by humans is going to be completely fallible. So
Flawed, to
they
say
can
the least.
they can certainly say, like, if it gets to that point, someone can certainly say, yes, we saw that this person was demonstrating, like, that they're going to be
predictive
that they're going to like go
indicators.
murder somebody or something like that,
or whatever. Yeah.
and they can come and fucking take
But
you
there's
for that.
also a history of big data being almost impenetrable to, unless they're specifically looking for something.
Yeah, but that's not
it's
true.
very hard to.
You're saying it becomes more generalized.
There becomes
kind
so
of,
much
but
information that it
you
requires
can't
too many
analyze
people
it.
to analyze
I get it.
That's
It
true
would
to
need
an
AI,
extent.
basically. to
That's
go
true.
through.
Well, that's exactly what I was just going to say. That's true to an extent.
I was waiting for you to get
Until
to it.
you have computers running that data and like coming up
To
with
an extent,
the scientific.
to find enough. Yeah, you're saying to find enough degree that
Right.
they actually can extract,
Quantum computing, I should say.
Yeah.
Is
or even if not that,
Maybe,
like,
but-
approaching it. Yeah,
But not even necessarily. Like the
right. I get both of your
the
points.
idea that computers can process so much information if we feed them the right
Yeah, but I'm
tools to do
referencing
that.
what, like, for instance, the NSA has and the amount of data. Yeah, like, there's a lot of fears for what the NSA could have done with it, but what they found out doing was, like, looking up ex-girlfriends and things like that. The information is
Because
so dense
you're saying
and so much.
they
and-
know human stuff.
Yes.
Yeah, I get it.
It
Sure.
is, but the thing is, I was gonna say the problem. I don't even know if it's necessarily a problem. I think it's just the necessary, not necessary, but like necessarily, this is what humans are going to do as the next step. Is they're going
It's sort of
to
ingrained.
take
you're
that.
saying.
They're going to take the data and try to figure out a way to process it, and eventually they're going to be able to figure out a way to process
If and
it,
when,
and it's
probably
going to
when
be
that happens, then
based
yeah.
on having a computer run algorithms and run that data through a certain filter that's going to pull out people that are scary to society or whatever.
Sure, or at least deemed dangerous. But again, who decides that? And yeah,
Right.
like that's like, as you were saying to start off with, it's the 1984 nightmare that could happen, may to an extent. But I think I do, like, as I think more and more about it, I was already pretty inclined to agree with this, but it's more like stumbling, and it's not like evil over. We're not doing for the evils. We're just doing it because that's what we've always done. We're just using this technology to do it.
I agree, and I think it's going to be completely. I think it's going to be like both a great thing and a possibly an evil thing, but like in completely different ways than anybody
Sure,
can really
Exactly.
fully predict. And it's kind of the same way that it always happens, where like there are people that predict certain things about the way the world is, and they're like, "Oh, this guy was like brilliant," but there's always a lot of things that were not predicted correctly.
Yes.
See, and I think that VR is ultimately not predicted correctly. There's going to be so much other aspects of like technology that is being developed now because we have a much more impact on our lives. Particularly, I'm a big fan of the augmented realities I started this out with.
Mhm.
The idea of like if you lose your arm, getting a robotic
Sure.
arm. I think those are all things we'll see in our lifetime. I think VR is something in the distance, and what we've seen now come out is going to be a glorified virtual boy.
I keep thinking of like VR, like how everybody's like doing everything with a 3D printer now, making this with a 3D printer. In a way, that's kind of like VR become physical. You
Kind
know,
of, yeah.
I mean, or
I see what you mean,
It's
yes.
what I'm saying is there's not a direct correlation, but it's similar in that here's something here and here's the physical of it.
Sure.
I think, but by the way, I think 3D printing is another big thing that's going to be.
Within those big
I think
categories.
I
you're
think we
saying.
have not even scratched the surface of what 3D printing is going to do to the world. And like
No,
specifically, I read a really interesting. I forget what it was. It was like a short story or an article about something years ago about 3D printing when it was first
on the cusp.
kind of it wasn't quite out yet, but it was just about to come onto the scene. And the idea of it was that this was years, and this is like a flash forward to the future type of thing. And like we sent spaceships out to Mars, and they 3D printed an entire
A habitat.
like
whatever.
habitat.
I read
Yeah.
that. I read that one.
And I
But
think that's a brilliant idea. I think things like that are going to happen in the
the
future.
thing is, my
You just have to
printer
bring the
doesn't even
materials.
work like my regular one, let alone a
A
3D
3D,
printer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
A device we rely upon.
Well, yeah,
Flash
you-
knows whatever the equivalent of toner cartridges are.
Sure, exactly.
Oh,
Using,
this could be
mean, that's all funny.
a living jam, like they're
Doing-
jammed with the printing.
Doing remote printing is hard enough as it is.
I
But
saw
like,
an article one time talking about like 3D printing actual meals a couple years ago. I'm like, oh, good.
It's a
They're already
possibility,
trying to do that,
maybe,
actually.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying is you still need the materials. You can't make
Sure.
t-
Can't
but
make
you can
something
take
out of
like
nothing. I get it,
theoretically, the idea was you could take the materials off of the planet and make a habitat out
Yeah.
of the materials that you mined out of Mars.
Sure.
But
And
anyway,
that's been explored various as well. But
that's
no,
off the topic,
yeah,
and I'm sorry.
it's okay. I think, as I was saying, like, or as actually even was saying, like, you kind of convinced me that you're right. It's not like we're going to have the holodeck anytime soon.
No.
Maybe eventually, but nevertheless, this is the first step, and possibly like the other avenues that you said, like the other, I guess, pillars of technological exploration now that are happening. They sort of may be like switching out, like which ones are going to be more impactful, more pervasive, I suppose.
See, I'm kind of a Ray Kurzweil individual
Yeah,
with the singularity
Yeah.
and the idea of us kind of ingraining with technology, and I feel that like augmentation and robotics have a lot more promise for that
Sure.
than virtual reality
I
does.
kind of agree, but nevertheless, I still think, as we all just discussed, it's quite interesting to think about how we may approach this new technology, given that we have very little, like a baseline sort of understanding of it, but we're not going to know for sure until it actually impacts, is available, and then we can start seeing the effects of it, whatever they may be.
Yeah, and even then it'll be years later
Sure,
when
exactly.
somebody actually studies what
you're right.
happened.
It might not even be apparent then. Sure.
Right.
So either way, though, I'm still looking forward to immersing myself into some kind of virtual false world, because this reality may itself be false. But that's not a topic for another day. But I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. So I, again, as always, have been Scott Thurlow, joined by Janie and Manzer.
So if virtual reality is a subset of infinite worlds, and we might be in one possible world of infinite worlds, is it really Turtles all the way down?
Of course, it always has been Turtles all the way down. Also joined by Chris Morgan.
Computer and program.
And Stephen Amosi.
I don't remember which color pill I'm taking.
You can simulate this episode whenever you so choose. Good night. This has been Syntax Error. Thank you as always for listening, and we will see you next time.
Music by Stephen Ormosi. Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow.
Syntax Error is part of a Lost Signals Productions. All rights reserved.